This channel is supported by Truefire.
Well, what is this all about then? It's the Truefire Summer Music Festival. What I'm going to tell you about, you can get 1 month of all access for just $1. The all access, you can dip in and out of every single course on Truefire, so that's a really great way to get some awesome courses down you.
About 3 weeks ago, maybe a little longer, that the Helix Stadium was announced, and I think we've all been quite excited about that. Following on, there was this video that came out from Line 6 which revealed the amp models that are going to come with the Helix Stadium at launch, and I thought this was worth talking about because there's a few real positives that have come out of this, and also I think, well, essentially let's just cut straight to the chase. There's going to be 16 amp models for guitar at launch, which is a lot less than we see from many modelers when they come out at launch. Like even Quad Cortex I think had 50. If we dig into the numbers a little bit more, it's like 40 actual what you would call amps, because normally across devices like Quad Cortex, Fractal, etc., they spread the channels, you know, like if you've got jumped channel 1, channel 2, this sort of thing, across 3 amp models, whereas now in the Helix Stadium, which is actually pretty interesting from a few point of views, there's a few sort of firsts here. They consolidate, for example, the deluxe reverb into 2 channels, so you've got a normal and vibrato, so that's a really good positive thing. Looking at the amp models, there's kind of your usual suspects there. So you've got your, like, well, what have you got? The Champ, Bassman, High Watt, Princeton, Deluxe, Twin, AC30, Plexi, 50 watt 2203, JCM 800 that is, Ecstasy Blue, Ecstasy Red, Soldano, and we've got the EV Panama, so that's the 5150, right? Both channels of that. We've got the Rev 120 Purple and the Rev 120 Red. And that about covers it. And then bass-wise, you've got Ampeg SVT, Ampeg B15, the US Drip bass, which is based on essentially a silver face. That one will definitely be worth looking at for guitarists too. 2 channels of that, bright and normal. And the Agoura 51 and Orange Marshall Super Bass. I think, is that the Malcolm Young amp? Also, it's really interesting, the visuals look pretty stunning, and I think, to be honest, this is probably the best a modeler has ever kind of looked. Even the Fender Tone Master Pro, I don't think the graphics looked as sort of state-of-the-art as this. So, let's get into, I guess, what is surprisingly missing. So there is one Vox there. There isn't the Matchless DC30. Now, the Matchless DC30 was the first amp that was added to Helix back in the day. I would have thought that might have been a good launch one, but obviously that's not on there. There's nothing particularly Dumbly yet. So in the original Helix, things like the Litigator were added after the fact as well, I think. In the Helix as well, Lonestar was added, the Mesa Boogie Lonestar, and the Mesa Boogie Mark IV, And more recently, and this would have been one that I would have really liked to see in there at launch, the Grammatico GSG 100. So this is John Grammatico's take on essentially Robin Ford's amp, which he had on his bench. And he's kind of recreated some of that Dumble magic. And that was the closest thing that we had to a Dumble within the Helix. So although all of the things that are not in the Agoura amps are already, they're going to be on the unit anyway because they're represented in legacy models, there are some definite things that are missing. In particular, there's no Mesa Boogies. Now, I think Mesa Boogie have kind of, in some ways, I don't think they're the flavour of the week at this point. Although they did just come out of that 2C plus, right? But so, you know, that no dual rectifier. Then there is the Soldano SLO. And, you know, in terms of the Mark amps, I think that's something that some guys will definitely be missing. There's a good selection of Fenders. I don't think we could be too sniffy at that. Although, again, surprising that the Super Reverb isn't there yet, because that's a more recent amp that they added in. I guess other positives, though, that we've been told by Eric in an interview is that the Agoura amp modelling process is a little bit quicker than in the past. So we could see this number grow fairly quickly, maybe, but if you also think that they're working on the proxy thing, and also, yeah, there's a lot of other stuff to work on. I guess you expect that there'll be some amp models coming fairly soon down the road, but I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath that it'd be super quick. Now, one thing that I definitely think is worth discussing is the fact that you've got multiple channels for some of these amps. So, you know, like if it is one of these style of amplifiers where you've got normal and vibrato, those are normally separated. So if you were trying to create presets with some of these stuff, you'd have to have two of the same amp model in there to basically get between those two channels if you wanted to. So that is reasonably cool. I guess typically the way that these amps would be used in general anyway would not be as channel switching anyway. So maybe it's much of a muchness. The Soldano, you can switch between the clean, overdrive and the lead. But it's interesting as well that the XC is still split across two amp models, and so is the Rev. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, altogether 40 amp channels. So I thought that was interesting, worth talking about, because it's kind of like, well, there's some stuff missing there. So I think, again, one thing that I sort of am going to presume is not going to come across is the Derailed Ingrid, because they only had that amp for a short amount of time. I think Dan Ball brought it in. That amp has since been sold, and I don't think Line 6 bought it, because I don't see it in too many of their photos or anything. I could check on that. I don't think they did. So the Trainwreck, which is one of my favourite amp models in the Helix altogether, is not coming across, certainly at launch, and I would be surprised maybe to see that. But I'd expect that there's going to be a bunch of Mesas brought through, like the Lonestar. I'd be looking forward to seeing that. I imagine a Mark IV. I imagine at some point a rectifier. There's a bunch more Marshalls that you could see that are in some of the older Helix bits and pieces. Typically, I think actually the Helix device list at this point is pretty robust. So in terms of what's missing in general, I don't know that there's loads. Like maybe a Morgan AC20 might be quite nice, although we've got Matchless and we've got Vox, so maybe it's quite well represented in that regard anyway. Other bits and pieces that might be missing, I don't know, what is there? Let me know in the comments what you think. And I think basically if you're into older style amps, you're going to be pretty happy. If you're into more modern heavy amps, then I think you're pretty likely to be quite happy as well. The people that are missing out, I guess, are those people that are a little bit in that midway point, like maybe some of you guys that are really into Nickelback or something like that, where the Mesa Boogies aren't necessarily well represented at this point. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. Were you surprised by that amount of amp models that were in there? Are you happy with that? What do you reckon? I think it's a brave choice potentially. Once proxy is here, of course, that would be kind of a thing that you could use to plug the gaps, as well as, which almost, you know, not many other devices have this, to fall back on all of the older Helix amp models. So it's kind of, you should be fine anyway, I guess.